Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is SewRena, and in today's video we're going to be sewing up my dream winter coat. I'm going to put up an example of the coat that I want to recreate right over here on the screen, and we will be using a pattern that we used a couple videos ago. It is a house coat pattern, which I will have right here. I will be using Simplicity 4471, the house coat pattern, and I'm going to make a couple alterations to make the coat of my dreams. If you have been here for a while, or maybe even just seen some of my live streams, I've talked about how I've been looking for some yellow wool, and I have been purchasing yellow wool online, which is not ideal when you're looking for a particular shade, and every time it has been wrong. But this time I actually purchased a yellow wool that I think will work. Only it's not heavy enough for what exactly I'm going to do. So basically in this case, two wrongs will make a right by the end of this video, because I'm going to use one of the older non-yellow wools to make this whole project come together. So if you're interested in seeing me pull this coat together and all the alterations that I do to make it work, then go ahead and hang tight. Like this video, subscribe to my channel, and let's get into it. For the weight of the coat, I'll be using the wool on the left. It is the camel looking wool. And for the outer fabric, we're going to be using this Melton wool on the right that looks more like a perfect yellow. And to line it and give all of the accents for the bow and the cuff, I'm going to be using this pale, almost sage green colored satin to pull this whole look together. So for the sake of scaling, I'm going to show you how I interline by using the sleeve for reference. So I use the darker wool on the inside and the lighter yellow wool on the outside. I pin everything together wrong side to wrong side. It doesn't really matter at this point because we're just going to take it to the sewing machine and sew it together so that this is one piece. The seam allowance for this piece is 5/8 of an inch, so when you're interlining, you're going to want to sew within the seam allowance, so that way when you put your entire coat together, you do not have to go back and remove any basting stitches. Because this is a pretty long and big coat, I only showed you the interlining process for this sleeve. However, I go in and interline all of the coat pieces, and the only piece I do not interline is the neck facing. To prepare the back of the coat, I sew 5/8 seam allowance down the center back, and then I attach the sleeve backs to each side of the coat back. Line up the notches on the back sleeve and the back of the coat. You might need to ease this a little and then pin it in place. After this, I move forward to working with the front of the coat. And here I have everything pinned on the floor with the interlining because I'm going to interline this piece. Then I go and cut the front sections, because once everything is interlined on the front, then you're going to want to repeat all of the same steps that I did for the center back. To prepare the front of the coat, you're going to add that dart in the front, and then you're going to take your front sleeve, line up the notches, and then pin all of the rest. And of course, you're going to want to make sure that you ease everything in. Everything should line up perfectly, and the fact that you did interline should not interfere with the way that you put this coat together. You just follow the directions after making that alteration. I thought I loved this house coat pattern before when I made that brown polka dot swing coat dress set, but now I love it even more because it is so beautiful and a very versatile pattern. So if you can get your hands on a copy of this pattern, I think it's worth it. I think it's beautiful as a house coat as illustrated, but as you can see, there's so much more you can do with it if you switch up the fabrics and make the alterations that work for what you have in mind. So here I'm pressing out the seams using my wooden clapper. For wool, you're going to want to make sure you use a lot of steam and then use the wooden clapper to lock that steam in to hold your seams open. If you do not have a wooden clapper, then what I used to use before was my pressing ham. Because I made my pressing ham and stuffed it with wood, like wood chipping and filing, it holds in the steam as well, but you do have to add a little bit more pressure. So now I am just marking the other side of the coat front by adding the dart and putting the fold seam for the center front, so that way I know to fold that over and press that. Once you sew the dart in, go ahead and press that flat, and then move forward to adding your sleeve like we did the back and the other side. At this point, everything is pinned, only the sleeves are sewn onto the front and the back, and it's time to figure out this bow that we're going to put in the front. I use some grosgrain ribbon to play with the length of the ties that I want. Make sure that you add a seam allowance to this, and also I highly suggest you use like grosgrain because then you can use the pieces that you cut off later for a waist tape. So I tie it into a knot and I mark where I want the knots to be, and I'll use that as a guide for drafting out my pattern for the neckties. So I mark off where the ties stop because I'm going to make the ends wider than I do the top. So I think the top is going to start off at 2 inches and then gradually go down to 3 inches wide. So once you tie everything into the knot, the first part where the tail comes out, mark that point because at that point you're going to want to start widening out your bow to meet the widest tip of your bow. So then I go ahead and start working on that after drafting my pattern, and I want to line it with a green satin so that way it shows just like the example that I am trying to recreate. For my ties, I did add a little bit of interfacing. You want to make sure that your interfacing is not too stiff because you don't want it to be too bulky considering we're using a coating material for this. If you are using more flimsy fabric, then of course you want to beef up your interfacing, but if your fabric already can hold its own weight, then I wouldn't put too much because you have to make a flat knot at the neck. Now it's time to work on the stand collar. So I was fortunate that this pattern already had a stand collar drafted. So all I had to do was kind of pleat the tie ends and make sure that it was sewn in at the end of the stand collar. I didn't have to make any adjustments for this apart from just making a pleat so that way my tie ends fit within the seam allowance of the collar. Moving on to the cuffs, I add a little bit of interfacing to the cuffs, and at this point I wanted to do a little bit of experimenting because I noticed in the example that the cuff had a little bit of the outer fabric showing. Usually this is when we understitch because we don't want the main fabric showing when you roll things over, but for this example we want it to roll over, and I didn't think that my fabric was heavy enough to cause that rolling, so I tried to go in with a layer of batting, well, 2 layers of batting to kind of beef it up. But then in the end I ended up taking some of it out and only leaving the batting really close to the seam where I sewed the lining and the main fabric together, because then it came out looking too bulky in a way that you could tell that the rest of the fabric wasn't that thick. So yeah, it definitely wasn't necessary for this particular project, but it was worth trying, so I know in the future not to do it again. Moving on to some personalization. For the neck facing, I decided to stitch out SewRena in a cute little atomic font that I found on Etsy. And I did this on the last project, but I just didn't show it, and I did it in a green thread similar to the lining. I also drafted some pockets for the side seams, which I don't usually do, but because this is a 1/4 length sleeve and I did not extend the sleeves on this one, I felt like it would be necessary to put my hand in pockets. And I also plan on wearing like long gloves with this as well, but then it'd be nice to have a pocket to store the gloves in since these gloves will probably only go with this outfit anyway. So now I'm adding notches so that way I can sew the pockets in smoothly and make sure that it's as seamless and as invisible from the outside as possible. Once the pocket is attached, I do understitch the pockets to make sure that they don't come out of the coat. And to do this, I just push the seam allowance towards the pocket facing, and then I stitch as close to the seam allowance as possible in a fabric or a thread that's close to the color of the fabric so it doesn't show. And now it's time to sew everything right sides together. It's time to attach the front of the coat to the back of the coat. So we're sewing up the shoulder seams, and then we're going to sew the side seams as well. If you have not already, please consider liking this video. It will really help push it through the algorithm. If you are enjoying yourself, go ahead and subscribe to this channel if you want to see more like it, and leave me a little comment below. This project is really quick to make, especially if you don't have to do an interlining, because essentially I had to cut this 3 times, including the lining. I do all of the lining off camera because it's the exact same method. The only difference is because I'm using this pattern twice in a row now, I decided to go ahead and trace out a lining piece to include with the pattern, because I can't imagine that I won't do this again and will need to line it again. So instead of having to draft it every single time or folding the main pattern, I just went ahead and cut a lining piece. I also saved the piece for the necktie, though I doubt I'll ever make this exact version again. I kept it just in case. Before the holidays, when I made the brown version of the swing coat, I did have to draft a new collar for it, and I did not keep that collar piece. I intended to, but I know once I cleaned up my room I probably accidentally threw it out. So if I ever make like that dagger styled sharp collar, I will have to draft that a second time. But so far, I really adore this pattern. I think it's amazing, and it has just the right amount of fullness, because I have made one other house coat pattern into a coat, and it was more A-line, so it leaned more 60s, which is exactly what I was going for. But if you want something like really wide and very tent shape, I highly recommend this pattern. The only thing that you can do differently, if you absolutely want to, is reduce the center front just a little. Since I'm not having to overlap to compensate for the button placket, I didn't need to leave it the way that it was. But in this case, I did leave it because I was like, I might add a hook and eye at the neck, and I might want it to overlap at the chest depending on what style dress I wear under it. I can't decide just yet. So just to protect myself in the future, because I am someone who gets colds very easily, I wanted to make sure that it could at the very least overlap around the neck area. I am so excited about this coat. I have been searching for the perfect yellow wool to make a coat for a very long time, and while I can't say that this particular fabric is the perfect yellow wool because it's not the weight that I needed to make a nice wool coat, thus why I had to interline it, I will say once I used what I already had to make it what I needed it to be, it is exactly what I wanted. I have been compiling yellow wool coat inspiration photos for years now, and to finally have one, and then even to see this style where I was able to incorporate my favorite color, which is green, makes me so happy. And I feel like you could make so many different versions of this. You could do it very monotone like the original, or you could do like a red outer coat with a pink satin lining. Like, the options truly are endless. So I would love to know in the comment section below, what color combos would you put together if you could? Thing that I forgot to mention in my first video of the year, where I talk about all of the vintage things that I would like to bring into 2024. One thing I should have mentioned was the different color varieties of wool coating from the 50s and the 60s, because it should not have been this hard to find a really nice yellow. And even still, if I could have tweaked it just a little, the yellow would have been a tad bit more pale than this one. Ultimately, I do not live in a super cold climate, so interlining with this was enough. But if you do need to beef yours up just a tad bit more, then you want to use some sort of thermal interlining, which you can get at your Joann's fabric, or some batting as well. I didn't need that, and even at the end it was kind of thick. Also, you're going to want to make sure you have plenty of needles, because at this point I did break a needle when sewing the collar on. I also recommend that you switch needles to more appropriate needles working with satin. You want to make sure that they're fine and very sharp microtex needles, so that way you don't put any runs in the fabric, and you don't want to work with dull needles with your satin needles. So at this point I would go ahead and change from the needle that you used for the coat when making the satin lining. Naturally, because I have the Janome, I added my initials to the lining. It's a touch I've been doing since I got it to all of my linings, and then I just sew it in by hand. Now it's time for the reveal, and this is the coat. It came out exactly how I wanted it to be. The only differences that I would say between the original and this one is I did not widen the sleeve, and that's just because I really wanted to stay warm and I felt like this would suit me better. Thank you all so much for watching this video. Don't forget to leave me a comment below, like, subscribe, and share this video with someone you think might enjoy it. If you would like to support my channel any further, you can leave me a virtual tip over on Ko-fi or become a bobbin over on Patreon. But of course, the best free way to support the channel is to like, share, comment, and subscribe. This is the coat on. I do plan on making a matching dress and I have gloves to go with this. So I have to figure out what it is I'm going to sew next. So thank you guys so much for watching and I'll see you in the next one.